So I'm going to go into the basics of the UC A&R pesticide policy. I do want to make just one comment. So this is in the UC A&R policy and procedure manual. It's a section 281, I believe. And I can put a link in the chat at some point in time. But it's been recently updated. I worked really hard with Jim Farrar and Catherine Montano to update this policy. And it was mostly just to clean up language, remove verbiage that was just repeating pesticide regulations that had changed and were no longer applicable or that were just different. So, you know, hopefully this policy is much more user friendly and it gives more specific instruction about selecting PPE and things like that. So when we're doing research with pesticides, so Sarah put a link in the chat, but the title of the policy is Policy on Pesticides and Related Chemicals. So for experimentation and demonstration. So we're going to talk, first about all the things that you have to do as a researcher using pesticides, the ways in which you can conflict with a registered label and the ways in which you cannot. Okay. So as a researcher, we have the right to conduct this research, and we also have corresponding responsibilities to do no harm and to conduct intellectually honest research. I really don't have any hesitation saying that we do that here. So anytime you're making pesticide applications, particularly in a research setting, there are risks and liabilities involved. And so you are responsible as a person responsible for the research, you're responsible to manage these risks and to mitigate them whenever possible. And, it's not just to cooperators and to the public, but there are risks to yourself and to your staff. So please keep that in mind. These are pesticides, even if they're lower toxicity products, they're pesticides. And so let's just treat them with the respect that they deserve and make sure that we're taking all the precautions that are required. So the policy tells us that all research, published pest management guidelines, and recommendations relating to pesticide use must be used and conducted in accordance with all applicable laws, regulations in this policy. So there are laws, federal and state laws and regulations that govern pesticide use, and many of them we have to follow, right? Even though we're researchers. But this policy does sort of exempt us from a few things, but not everything. You still are going to have to do things like train your employees and wear the appropriate personal protective equipment, okay? But we're allowed to sort of go against the label in certain respects for the purposes of research. Okay. So the scope of the policy, it's A&R employees or UC employees who use pesticides for experimental purposes. It's actually not restricted to A&R employees because the policy does include ag experiment station faculty and personnel. So it's not just A&R, although a lot of this pesticide research is conducted in accordance with, in connection with A&R. But it covers you when you're doing pesticide research in any field test or even a field demonstration. So that does allow you to use experimental pesticides or registered pesticides in an experimental way in a field demonstration when you're trying to show efficacy or a new method to the public to encourage them. So the pesticide policy applies to us whether we're on campuses, field stations, research and extension center, or even off UC property when we're working with cooperators. And our cooperators can be like private growers, but they can also be public land like BLM or parks or something like that. So it's basically you're on UC property or you're on cooperators land. That's like two major distinctions. So technically the A&R policy does not include pesticide use in a greenhouse or a laboratory. So pesticide use in these facilities still have to follow federal, state, and local laws and regulations, but it's not, the use is not mandated by this policy. The use isn't, the rules and regulations about applying in a greenhouse or laboratory aren't covered in this policy. You can still do research, but here's the thing. It's just another, or it's like Brian Oatman's group that's going to tell you what you can and can't do in the lab and in the greenhouse. So if you have some specific questions on that, I might have to refer you to Brian. But basically, I was always told by my predecessor, Rick Melnico, that in a greenhouse or a lab, you treat your greenhouse like a lab. So however you deal with pesticides in your lab, that's how you're going to deal with them in your greenhouse. And they become part of your chemical hygiene plan. So whatever chemical inventory that you maintain, you know, in that greenhouse, in that lab, then you would do the same in the greenhouse. And you treat pesticides like they are one of your other chemicals. I mean, pesticides are chemicals, they're just special. And so you still, you know, all applicable laws and regulations still apply to you, however. But anyway, so sometimes it can be tricky because some people do research in a lab and then they move into a greenhouse and then they move it into a field situation.
Hey, Lisa, we have one question about what if we'll be addressing pesticide application near schools today.
I don't think that I have that planned, but if there's time, I'm happy to address it. I'll have to sort of search for that handout. I have a handout that might help you. Or we can talk offline about that. So if there are other people who are interested in talking about pesticide application in areas close to schools, then when we get to that poll towards the end, if that's not on the poll, I don't really remember at the moment because there's too many things in my brain, then I'll ask you to put that in the chat so then I can, you know, get a sense for if there's a lot of people who want to hear about that, we can talk about that in lieu of one of the other topics. So thank you for that question. So the first poll, we're sitting here talking about pesticides. So what's a pesticide? Sarah's going to launch that poll for us.
Okay, so the first poll is asking, which of the following are considered pesticides in California? And you can choose all of the responses that you see fit. So we have insecticides, adjuvants, pheromones for mating disruption, pheromones for monitoring pests, plant growth regulators, herbicides, fungicides, and clove oil. So which of those are considered pesticides in California? All right, I'll give just a few more seconds for a few more people to respond. All right, the people have spoken. I'm going to end the poll and let's share the results. So Lisa, I'll let you respond.
Okay, so 100% of the respondents said that insecticides are pesticides. I mean, obviously, right? Adjuvants in California do have to be registered. Now, keep in mind, to my knowledge, those are not, I mean, they're not in general registered by EPA. There might be a couple of exceptions because of the way they work, but they do have to be registered in California. So they will have a California registration number. So if you are using pheromones, there are two primary uses for pheromones, and one of them is considered a pesticide and one of them is not. So pheromones for mating disruption, that's a pesticide. Whereas pheromones, you know, just the traps for monitoring pests, that is not considered a pesticide, which is just to say that a pheromone that is used for mating disruption is going to require a registration or an exemption for from a registration. And if you don't have those two things, it becomes experimental, and that's fine. I think I'm going to advance my slide just so you can see the poll and maybe some of the words at the same time, but I still want to share this. So plant growth regulators are registered in California as pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, obviously, we all know this. And then clove oil although it is a pesticide. So this one is like the trick question in the bunch. Clove oil, depending on how you're using it, it could be used as a pesticide, but it happens to be federally exempt from the requirement of a registration. It's one of those 25B products. And so it is a pesticide, but there's certain things that don't apply because it's not registered. So like you don't have to report pesticide use. So we can talk about that. So really it's like the intent of the use of the product. So it's pretty clear if something has an EPA registration number, it's a pesticide, right? So I think we understand that very well. But then there are just these other nuanced things that are either, based on intent of use or because we're in California, right? So again, adjuvants not registered by EPA, but registered here in California, pheromones, plant growth regulators, and anything that's maybe not traditionally considered a pesticide, but that you're using it to kill a pest. And so it's any chemical or whatever that you're using to defoliate a plant, to regulate plant growth, to prevent, destroy, mitigate, kill a pest. Okay, if you're trying to use it like you would use a registered pesticide, then it's a pesticide and you have to treat it like one. So some materials that are pesticides, as some people don't really realize that, Clorox, and then, disinfectants and sterilizers, for benches, countertops, COVID, those are all pesticides. I don't know if anybody's actually doing research on those. I mean, you can use them, it's fine. But if you're doing research with them, I just want you to recognize that they are pesticides and that you would have to treat it like such. Algicides, animal repellents, certain pheromones, as we mentioned. And so in general, for these uses to be, non-experimental and not in conflict with the label, everything that you do has to be supported by a label. And so if you don't have an EPA registered label and a California registered label that you're following all the instructions, that means you're likely using the pesticide in conflict with a label, which means it's probably an experimental use. And that's fine. You just have to make sure that you're following this policy when you do that.
So Lisa, there's a question in the Q&A that's a great segue for that question. They're asking if the label is registered through EPA, but not in California, can they do experimental research?
Yeah. That's a great question. So if you do, and we'll get to that. I probably am getting ahead of myself, but I'll just skip through that slide when I get there. So if there is a pesticide that's registered by EPA, but it's not yet registered by California or not submitted for registration, whatever. If it's registered by EPA, but not here in California, it is considered experimental use, but it is still a little different. If you have a federal label, there's certain exceptions to certain things. So we'll get there, but it is technically considered experimental. Okay.
Hey, Lisa, there's another question in the chat. It's asking, is alcohol considered a pesticide if it's used to disinfect pruning tools?
Isopropyl alcohol, yes, it is. But
Great.
It's not, but my interpretation of that is it's not an experimental pesticide use. It's just a pesticide, and that's fine. You have to follow the label instructions. You need to wear appropriate PPE. You need to wash your hands, whatever. But it is technically a pesticide. It's, lots of disinfectants are, the active ingredient is isopropyl alcohol and other things that you wouldn't necessarily consider a pesticide, but you're using it to kill probably microbes or germs or virus particles or plant pathogens or something like that. So it is, but my interpretation is that you're not using it in an experimental way. So just follow the use instructions. So an experimental pesticide can be a brand new pesticide, right? Okay, it's a numbered compound. We don't have any kind of label for it at all, right? That's clear. Or it could be like a new formulation. Somebody is developing a new formulation for the same active ingredient that is already registered in different ways, right? So new products containing old active ingredients, it's not just a numbered compound that's an experimental pesticide, okay? Basically, if no federal and California label exists, it is an experimental pesticide. Or if you have a label that's registered here in California, but you're not following the directions, right? So you're using it in conflict with the label. That means, and it's an experimental pesticide use, okay? And just to be clear, Josephina farmer down the road or your local parks person, they can't use pesticides in the same way that you can, okay? They have to be working with the researcher that either has a research authorization or works under this pesticide policy or a similar pesticide policy. So that's the distinction. Think in your head, okay, can my colleagues at the Parks Department make this application? No, they cannot. Okay, that's experimental. Okay, so then I have to make sure I'm following the policy. So the last thing on here is if you're using this in conflict with a California or an EPA registered label, that's experimental. So let's talk about what in the world is use in conflict. So we're going to launch this poll.
Okay, so this poll is asking which of the following are considered use in conflict with the California approved label? And again, on this one, you can choose all the ones that you think apply. So the options are, I'm using a rate that is higher than what the label tells me to use. I'm using a rate that is lower than what the label tells me to use. I'm using a labeled rate on a crop that is listed on the label. I'm using a labeled rate on a crop that is not listed on the label. I am harvesting before the pre-harvest interval has passed. And last but not least, I am harvesting after the pre-harvest interval has passed. So which of those are considered use in conflict with a California label?
So I just want to recognize that Sarah took her certification exam yesterday for the demonstration and research category, and she passed the test. So
Ooh.
I'm sure that she could answer this poll correctly.
You know what? That's funny. I was going through it in my head and I was like, yeah, I think these are right. So good stuff. Yeah, I was using when John was teaching, I was studying as well. Great study materials, these webinars. All right, so I think we've got pretty much almost everyone has responded. And again, if you can't see the polls, feel free to put your answers in the chat, and we can, make sure that we're recording that so that you can get the full credit for today's webinar. All right, but I'm going to end it and I'm going to share the results. All right, Lisa, take it away.
Okay, so, I'm going to just talk to the poll. So let's go through these. 95% of you, so use in conflict, right? It means I have a registered label, but I'm not following the right instructions. So to be clear, if you have a use in conflict, that makes it an experimental use, okay? And you can do that. I mean, we have this privilege that we have this policy and it allows us to do that. So if you are using a rate that is higher than what the label tells me to use, that is an experimental use. And so 95% of you knew that, and I applaud you. So if you are using a rate that is lower than what the label tells you, that's not actually experimental. It's not in conflict because you're backing off of the label. You can't exceed the label rate, but you can do a lower label rate. Oftentimes it's not really recommended or a good practice just for pesticide resistance purposes, but it certainly doesn't make it an illegal application. So if you are using a labeled rate on a crop that's listed on the label, it's not experimental, it's not use in conflict. You may be incorporating it into your trials either as an industry standard or just to test the efficacy, and that's fine, but it's not use in conflict, so it's not considered an experimental pesticide use. I am using a labeled rate, but I'm doing it on a crop that's not actually covered by the label. That's experimental. That's use in conflict. So then you have to treat it like an experimental pesticide application. If you are harvesting before the pre-harvest interval, that is experimental. So I would like anybody, all of you in the chat to tell me what I mean by the pre-harvest interval. So let's define this term before I quiz you on it. Maybe I should have done that before, but tell me in the chat what you think the pre-harvest interval means, what it means to you. I don't know, people are feverishly typing a long response or something. Okay. Okay. I'm getting a lot of good responses. Yeah, these look great. So it means the time that has to elapse between your last pesticide application of the season and when you harvest that commodity. Okay. So if your pre-harvest interval is 7 days and you're harvesting 6 days after the application, you are using that pesticide in conflict with the label. And that just makes it an experimental use. But maybe you're, doing a test. Can we harvest early? But if you're harvesting after that 7-day interval, it's totally fine. That's not use in conflict. Basically, if you're doing anything that's mucking around with the amount of pesticide residues that are, if you're increasing the amount of active ingredient per unit area per season, or if you're mucking around with the amount of residues that are going to be on that field on that commodity at the end of the season, then it's use in conflict. So it does not include, applications at lower than label rates, less frequent application intervals. So for example, if the retreat interval is every 14 days and you want to retreat every 20 days, totally fine. But if the application retreat interval on the label is 14 days and you want to do it every 7 days, that is use in conflict. Okay. So tank mixes, not all appropriate tank mixes are listed out on the label. Typically, and some labels actually say, oh, this is good when tank mixed with this other product. But there's not, an exhaustive list of all of the tank mixes that you could use with this product. But sometimes there is a notation on the label that says, do not tank mix with this product or with this active ingredient. So if you decide to tank mix with something that's prohibited on the label, then that's use in conflict. But usually it's prohibited because there's some kind of like negative interaction between the chemicals. So I would really think twice about that. So if you want to use that pesticide against pests that are not on the label, it's actually not use in conflict. Okay. So if you have, this has happened recently with some citrus pesticides because the Asian citrus psyllid is a new and emerging pest. And so that wasn't necessarily on all the insecticide labels. So it's actually not use in conflict if you're following all label directions, including the label rate for similar insects. You can use it to target a pest that's not on the label. Okay. You have to just make some good educated decisions. So if you increase the concentration of a mixture, as long as you're applying the same amount of active ingredient per unit area, if that recommendation is published in one of our pest management guidelines, then it's not use in conflict. So that just means you can put out less water per acre, right? Or per unit area, because you're not always applying on an acre basis. But as long as the amount of active ingredient per unit area, it is not increased. Okay. So any questions on use in conflict with the label? Is there another situation that we didn't cover that might be use in conflict and you want to talk about it?
We have a question, since you defined PHI, how you would define harvest. For example, shaking nut crops or picking or.
I believe that when you remove the commodity from where it's growing, that is the definition of harvest. I can look at the regulatory definition, but that would be my definition. I guess it's a little bit unique in nut crops where you're shaking them, but you don't remove them from the field. But it is the time when you remove it from the tree. That's my definition. Just like, broccoli, once you cut that head, then that's harvested. Because if there are and it's because of this, because if your pesticide, for example, is systemic and it's moving through the plant tissues and just sort of disintegrating in that way, you know, because pesticide residues disintegrate over time. Once you cut, once you remove the almond from the tree or cut the broccoli from the plant, it can no longer, you know, that part is no longer living. It's essentially no longer living. It's not getting any food or water from the main plant. So that's, to me, that's harvest, because it has everything to do with the pesticide running through the plant tissues. So any follow-up questions on that?
Yeah, we have a question from George about grape leaves. Midsummer, is that harvest?
Oh, taking
Grape leaf.
deshojando. How do you say that in English? Removing the leaves. If it's just the leaves and it's not something that people are gonna, if people are actually eating the grape leaves, then yeah, that's harvest. But if they're not, no, it's not harvest. It's whatever part that somebody is actually going to consume, either eat or drink or, you know, whatever, or feed to an animal. It's that part of the plant that comes off that makes it harvest. So if you're just de-leafing, I don't know how to say it in English, I'm sorry. If you're just de-leafing for, you know, powdery mildew prevention or what have you, then no, that's not harvest. It's just de-leafing. Okay, any other questions?